Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, June 3rd, 2025, and today we're going to be talking about a brand new poll from Atlas Intel, the most accurate pollster from the 2024 presidential election, and the numbers they are releasing today in the 2026 generic ballot. Now, before this video gets started, I want to say that I apologize for the hiatus that I took from this channel for about 2 weeks. Around mid-May, I finished my classes, my final classes for undergrad, and at the end of the month, I ended up graduating recently with my degree in government, which is really exciting. I moved to Washington, D.C. for the summertime, and it's a really interesting place to be, especially in this moment. But where I'm at really doesn't matter. The point is that I apologize for having been so delayed on creating content in a very, very newsworthy past 2 weeks. So had taken some time for myself for graduation to take it all in. But now I'm back. Now I'm ready and really excited to talk about the things that we are talking about today, and we'll continue to talk about for the remainder of the summer. And so, looking at Atlas Intel, again, as I mentioned in the very first part of this video, Atlas Intel was the most accurate pollster in 2024. And it matters because on the presidential level, there were many pollsters that, leading up to the election, we weren't quite sure if they were going to get things right. And Atlas Intel, I will admit, I approached with apprehension coming off the 2020 and 2022 midterms because I didn't think that Atlas Intel, at least at brass tacks, was going to be the most accurate pollster. I thought that they were going to be strong. I thought they were going to be right in some regards, but I did not think that their final verdict, that Donald Trump would be winning the national popular vote, would pan out to be true. I mean, I admitted as such in my video reflecting on my election prediction where, yes, it was wrong in where it was predicted. But looking at Atlas Intel, you can agree or disagree with the way that I made my own predictions and my assumptions about different pollsters, but what you can't argue with is the fact that Atlas Intel, again, was the most accurate pollster from the last cycle. And what they actually show us is quite interesting, especially when it comes down to the way that it correlates with Donald Trump's approval rating on the national level. Now, you already know, based off the title of this video, what the generic ballot actually says. But I'm going to start off by showing you what they tell us about where Donald Trump's approval rating currently is. Now, Atlas Intel, again, was very much going against the grain back in 2024 when they predicted ultimately that Donald Trump would win the national popular vote. Standard Convention had told us that Republicans had not won the national popular vote since 2004 and that Donald Trump probably wasn't going to be the one who would do it after Biden just won nationally 4 years prior by 4.5%. But indeed, he did it. A lot of the big-name pollsters like the New York Times and Siena College and NBC News and Ipsos and Harris and Morning Consult and Marist College, all of which said Kamala Harris would either tie or have the upper hand in the national popular vote. And so that made Atlas Intel, in very many cases, an outlier. And in the data they are presenting today, they also stand to be outliers. But again, cautioning and understanding that Atlas Intel is no stranger to being out on the fray, being on the outside of what is deemed to be normal in American politics, yet somehow being accurate not once, but twice. And what they find in terms of Donald Trump's approval rating is quite interesting at the baseline. Because Nate Silver and Real Clear Politics do these averages, we actually see that the numbers are actually getting a little bit better for Donald Trump. What was -10 nationwide has been a resounding upkeep to -4% nationwide. That's about a 6-point improvement for Donald Trump in the span of roughly a month. And so that really brings us to a point of understanding, well, if Donald Trump is doing better, certainly Republicans must be doing better too. After all, they were losing the generic ballot a month ago. They should be winning it today. But that's not what Atlas Intel or anybody else is really saying. Although Donald Trump is able to bring this approval rating on Real Clear Politics down to -2.2% nationally, again, a huge upkeep, or not upkeep, I guess that's not the right word for it, a huge sense of upward mobility for Donald Trump, a continuous one over the past 4 weeks, since May 1st, you'll see that the generic congressional vote hasn't gotten better for Republicans, but in fact, slightly worse. And I know that might seem counterintuitive. How is it possible that Donald Trump's approval rating is going up, the direction of the country numbers are going up, and yet the Republican Party is somehow performing worse? Well, there's 2 explanations that we can sort of understand where we are right now. The type of voter that is likely to vote in the midterm elections is radically different than that of the previous midterm elections in which Democrats did poorly, 2014, 2010, 2002. In the early day and ages of the 21st century, and even around the midpoints of the 2010s, the best voting bloc for Republicans tended to be older voters, white voters, and richer voters. Wealthier voters is a better way of putting it. But now, with the changing demographic breakdown of both political parties, Democrats are starting to make improvements amongst more educated voters, wealthier voters, older voters, white voters in general. And what that means is that when you throw in a few polls with a likely voter screen, you tend to find that is those same voters that Democrats are improving upon that you will find to be are the most likely to vote. On top of that, it's a two-pronged answer. One can be explained slightly by that. But on the other hand, too, there is in fact a persuasion benefit that Democrats have seen. That although Donald Trump might be disapproved of by just 2.2%, it doesn't mean all of those who approve of the job that Donald Trump is doing want Republicans to stay in office in every single chamber. What you'll find very evidently in elections is that there are candidates, strong candidates, who hold approval ratings that are very high, but only end up winning 52-53% of the vote. Because just because you approve of the job that somebody is doing doesn't mean that you are going to vote with them or their political party. And that's what might be happening here. The difference between this and Trump 1 is that in the first administration that Donald Trump was president, the expectations back then were that Donald Trump was going to poll worse than Republicans. But now Republicans are polling worse than Donald Trump. And that is interesting. Interesting at baseline. And I think it's because voters want to give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt this time around in comparison to the first time. That's why I think he did better in the presidential election than he did in 2016, and obviously better than he did in 2020. And I think that voters, again, have this sense of optimism to the executive branch. That they might be thinking, okay, Donald Trump's policies might work later down the line, but it doesn't mean that Republicans are more liked. It doesn't mean that Republicans are going to win the midterms. It doesn't mean that these Republicans are going to be doing well against Democrats. And you might be thinking, okay, is there any precedent where that is really a good example or where we could use that as an explanation? Well, I would look no further than the most recent one. Looking at the 2022 generic ballot, I am reminded of a very similar set of circumstances that resulted in Democrats actually doing a lot better than what their approval rating might have suggested. When you take a look at Trump's approval rating, it's negative 2.2%, but Biden's was a lot worse in the 2022 midterm elections. When you take a look at where we were in November of 2022, you'll see that while Joe Biden started off strong in his presidency, ended at a very weak point around the midterms with an approval rating of negative 12.6%. But that didn't translate to Republicans winning nationally by 12.6%. What it translated to was a 2.8% victory on the national level. In theory, Democrats outran their president by roughly 10 points nationwide. That is substantial. It matters because it's something that might happen this time around where, although Donald Trump, might be in a position where, in theory, by the time we reach the midterms, could be as disapproved of, that we could see Republicans do slightly better. But we're actually seeing the inverse this time around because we saw a lot of these arguments when talking about the midterms, talking about if this is like 2018 where Trump will be down 15 but Democrats will win by 8. It might be the inverse this time. And actually similar not to President Biden, who I just referenced in terms of an example, but down to the next president before Trump, President Obama, where we can see an approval rating, if you look at it that way, in the midterm elections did not correlate with the loss that this party received, explaining that in the reality that we are in right now, which looks closer to the Obama curve than the Biden one, which is that a president might be approved of a lot more than his party will be voted for. Take a look at this. Back in 2010, in Obama's first midterm elections, he held an approval rating of 45.4%. Feels roughly similar to that where Donald Trump is today at 47.5%. Taking a look at the disapproval, the overall net was negative 2% or 4% nationwide. Right now, Donald Trump is at negative 2.2%. It wasn't good for Obama, and it isn't good for Trump either, but it seems to have maintained itself. But the election results told an entirely different story, enough so that it raised conversation as to whether or not President Obama is the person to lead the party into the next presidential election. Obviously, a short-lived conversation, and one that would have inevitably answered with Barack Obama's victory over Mitt Romney in 2012. But what I look to are those midterm election results, where the House of Representatives went from 257 seats for the Democratic Party down 63 to 193. Yet, Obama's approval rating didn't make sense, at least for the moment, because it was in this month that you could really see that it was just a steady disapproval of Obama, but nothing substantive, at least enough not to matter, in my opinion, that we would have been talking about it to the extent that we might be if the midterm elections look similar to that of 2010. Because the Republican Party did phenomenally and won the national popular vote by a larger margin again than the disapproval rating for Obama. Meaning that if there were voters out there that were screened in those approval polls, many of them might have said, I approve of the job that Obama is doing, but I'm voting for the Tea Party. Weirder things have happened in American politics, and this is very similar. And so getting back to that point, back to the 2026 generic congressional vote and looking at the Atlas Intel poll, again, understanding that Democrats being up by 9, and yes, Trump's approval being similar, and Democrats in general leading this generic ballot makes sense. And the fact that Democrats are leading by a higher point than Trump is disapproved of nationally on the net also might make sense, even if it didn't in the first Trump administration. Because the American public is in a very different place than they were 8 years ago, voting patterns may look radically different. The election results may look radically different. While 2018 was on net a very strong year for the Democratic Party, we saw a lot of worry signs for the Democrats in a number of key and crucial districts. When you look down to Florida, a state that would inevitably switch over to being a very solid and locked-in Republican state, you will find that 2018, despite all that it was good for the Democratic Party, was a worrying sign. Why? Because areas that included Miami-Dade, like Florida's 27th district and Florida's 26th district, only ended up going to Democrats by narrow amounts. In theory, they should be going by large amounts. And looking at an example like 2012, the last time the Democrats had won in Florida, that 26th district went to the Democrats by 10.6%. And even when you take a look at the same way that 2020 voted, again, warning sign after warning sign, that the counties the Democrats had just won 2 years prior, both of them had flipped. But not to mention that there was a county here across the state the Democrats were able to keep competitive. 12, 6, 9 ended up being in 2020 pretty solid and locked in for the Republican Party. Then redistricting came, and we saw that Republicans did very well in 2022 and 2024. But it wasn't just Florida that was a warning sign in the midterms. What I think we might see again in terms of this radically different electorate is that although Democrats again made those improvements in 2018, 2026 might look like improvements in completely other different areas of the country that maybe we weren't looking at, maybe we weren't expecting, maybe minority groups and voting patterns and demographic groups that Democrats weren't targeting initially 8 years ago might become their saving grace in 2026. And although Democrats aren't leading the generic ballot like they were in 2018, and nobody is denying that, it still is in a position where it's better than where it was in 2024. And looking at how narrow this House majority is, a shift of what was, let's see, the popular vote margin, I believe, back in 2024, yes, 1.6%. Right now, Democrats leading by 2.5%. I mean, you're talking about roughly a 3.1% shift. And when you look at that, and you just edit the margins here, and you shift all of the states in a direction, or all of the districts in a way, by 3.5%, you end up with a congressional map that looks like this. Democrats at 225, which is a higher majority than what Republicans have had in 2024, in 2022, and even Democrats held after the 2020 election. And so at baseline, Democrats are in a strong position, and this Atlas Intel poll only reaffirms what we've understood. And while I do think that it very much reads as an outlier, we have doubted Atlas Intel before, and to our detriment in understanding how these elections work. And while I don't think Democrats will win the national popular vote by 9, I do think that it is certainly possible that Atlas Intel is picking up on data and picking up on the perceptions of Americans in the way they did in 2024 that raised them a lot of ridicule and concern that ended up being vindicated by the time the November election came around. Something similar could be happening this time around. And looking at the data, I'd rather be a Democrat today in electoral politics than a Republican for a multitude of reasons, and this adds an additional one. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.